A boot punched through rotted floorboards. Cold air rushed up from somewhere below. The lantern swung from a nail and threw long shadows across pine walls that should have collapsed years ago. A slow knock answered from beneath the boards. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. The man froze with one knee on the floor and one hand on his rifle. The knocking did not sound like an animal. It sounded like a question. He set the rifle down and pressed his ear against the wood. The taps came again. Closer this time. Patient. As if whatever was down there had waited a very long time for company. His name was Eli Whitlock. He had paid $4 for this cabin at a county auction. He had not read the small print. Who was knocking from a cellar that had been sealed for 40 winters. Stay with me on this one. He had not spoken to his family in 20 years. Not since the night his father slid a folded paper across the kitchen table and told him to sign it or leave. The paper was a sale agreement. A timber company wanted the trapline. The trapline that had belonged to his grandfather. Eli was 22 then. He read the paper twice. He pushed it back across the table and walked out the front door with a duffel bag and a rifle and a thermos of coffee his mother had filled without saying a word. He went north. He spent the first winter in a borrowed tent. He learned to set marten and fox by watching old men in roadhouses and copying what they did. He learned which creeks froze first and which never froze at all. He learned that a man who minds his own line does not need a family to eat. He told himself this every November when the dark came down at 3 in the afternoon. 2 decades passed. His beard went gray at the edges. His hands grew thick and slow to warm. He moved between rented trailers and bunkhouses and the back rooms of fur buyers who paid in cash and never asked his last name. He never married. He never went home. He saw his father's obituary in a newspaper left on a diner counter in Whitehorse. He read it twice. He paid for his coffee and walked out and did not cry until he was 3 miles down the highway. The letter came in March. A clerk in a county office had been ordered to clear unpaid parcels. Land that had reverted to the county. Land nobody wanted. The clerk had found a Whitlock on a tax roll from 40 years back and a forwarding address from a fur buyer, and the letter had bounced through 3 post offices before it reached him. The parcel was 40 acres on the north slope of Crowfoot Ridge. There was a structure on it. The minimum bid was $4. The clerk had underlined the word collapsed. Eli read the letter at a folding table in a trailer outside Watson Lake. He read it 3 times. Crowfoot Ridge was where his grandfather had run his line. It was the same land his father had tried to sell. Somehow the timber sale had never gone through. Somehow the land had sat. He drove to the county office the next morning with 4 crumpled dollars and a driver's license that had expired 6 months ago. The clerk did not check the date. She stamped the deed and slid him a key on a piece of baling wire. The key was older than she was. He drove north for 2 days. He stopped at a hardware store in Carmex and bought a tarp and a roll of plastic sheeting and a sack of nails and a pry bar. He bought a kerosene lantern even though he had a headlamp. Headlamps make you look in one direction. Lanterns let you see the room. He did not know yet why that thought came to him. He would learn. The road ended 4 miles short of the ridge. He shouldered his pack and walked the rest of the way in fresh snow. The cabin came into view through the spruce at last light. It was smaller than he remembered from his grandfather's stories. The roof sagged in the center like a tired back. One wall leaned inward. The door hung crooked on a single hinge. But the logs were still there. 60 years of weather, and the logs were still there. His grandfather had cut them by hand. Eli put a gloved palm against the wood and stood like that for a long minute. Then he pried the door the rest of the way open and went inside. The first night he did nothing but clear. He swept rodent droppings into a corner. He hauled out a broken cot and a stovepipe bent like a question mark. He nailed plastic across the worst gap in the roof. He boiled snow on a camp stove and ate cold beans from a can. The wind moved through the gaps in the walls and made a low sound like a man humming far away. He slept in his coat on the floor with his rifle within reach. He slept the way a trapper sleeps, one ear open. He woke once around 3. He thought he had heard something. He lay still and listened. There was only the wind. He told himself it was the wind. He went back to sleep. The second day, he worked on the floor. The boards in the center room were spongy and split. He pulled up the worst of them with the pry bar and stacked them by the door for kindling. Underneath the boards he expected dirt. Most cabins this old sat on dirt. But under the boards he found another layer of wood. Heavier wood. Sawn timbers laid tight against each other and pegged with iron. It was a subfloor. He had never seen a trapline cabin built with a subfloor. He stood in the half-light and looked down at it, and felt the back of his neck go cold for no reason he could name. He covered the spot with the tarp and kept working on the walls. He did not pull up the subfloor that day. He told himself it was because the light was going. That was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that the iron pegs in the subfloor were too new. 40 winters, and they had no rust on them at all. He worked until dark. He cooked again. He ate again. He listened to the wind. The wind was different here. The trees behind the cabin were spruce and pine like everywhere else on the ridge, but the wind in them did not sound right. It sounded thinner, as if the air moving through the branches was traveling through something hollow underneath. He told himself he was tired. He told himself a man who has been alone too long starts to hear things in trees. He banked the stove and lay down on the floor. He was almost asleep when the first knock came. It came from directly beneath his ear. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. He sat up so fast the lantern rocked. He held his breath. He waited. The knocking came again. The same rhythm. Slow and deliberate and patient. He picked up the lantern and crawled across the floor on his knees. He pulled back the tarp. The subfloor lay there. Heavy sawn timbers pegged tight. He pressed his ear against the wood. The knocking came once more. It was directly under his cheek. He could feel the vibration in his jawbone. He pulled back. He sat against the wall. He stared at the floor for a long time without moving. He did not sleep again that night. He sat with the rifle across his knees and watched the boards. The knocking came twice more before dawn. Each time in the same rhythm. Each time as if it were waiting for an answer. He did not give it one. When the gray light finally came through the gap in the roof, he stood up. His knees popped. His hands shook a little, which they had not done since he was a boy. He set the lantern down on the table he had built from the broken cot the day before. He took a long drink of cold water from his thermos. He set the thermos down. He sat on the edge of the table. He took 3 slow breaths. The knocking had stopped with the daylight. The cabin was just a cabin again. He almost laughed. He almost told himself he had dreamed it. Then he looked down at the floor and saw that the tarp had been pulled back tight against the subfloor timbers. He had pulled it back in the dark. He had pulled it back to listen. He had not put it back. But the tarp now lay smooth and flat against the wood, as if a careful hand had folded it down. He sat very still. He did not move. He watched the tarp. The tarp did not move. He sipped his water. He told himself the wind. He told himself a man alone forgets what he has done in the dark. He set the cup down on the table. The cup made a small clean sound against the wood. And from beneath the floor, a single knock answered it. He moved fast. He did not think. He grabbed the pry bar from the corner and dropped to his knees on the subfloor. He drove the bar between 2 of the heavy timbers. He levered. The iron pegs groaned. One pulled loose. Then another. He worked his way down the seam. The timbers came up one at a time. They were heavier than they should have been. He stacked them by the door without looking at them. Cold air rose from the hole he was making. Cold air and the smell of old iron, and something else he could not name. Not rot. Not animal. Something dry. Something that had been sealed. He cleared a square hole big enough to lower himself through. He lay flat and held the lantern down. The light fell on a packed earth floor about 6 feet below. There were walls of stacked stone on 3 sides. The fourth side was different. The fourth side was a door. An iron door set into the stone. The door had a heavy bar across it. The bar had a chain. The chain had a padlock. The padlock was black with age, but it was not rusted. Somebody had oiled it. Somebody had oiled it not very long ago. On the earth floor at the foot of the door sat a small wooden box. On top of the box sat a leather-bound book. The book was open. The pages were turned to the middle. Even from above he could read the handwriting on the page, because the script was big and looping and unmistakable. It was his grandfather's hand. He would have known it anywhere. His grandfather had taught him to write with a pencil at this exact slant on the kitchen table at Christmas when he was 8 years old. He lowered himself through the hole. His feet touched the earth. The cellar was small, 8 feet by 10. The air was cold, but it was not the wet cold of underground. It was a dry cold, a held cold, as if the room had been kept this way on purpose. He stepped to the box. He picked up the book. He held the lantern close. The first entry on the open page was dated 41 years ago. Late October. The handwriting was steady, but the lines crowded close together as if the writer had been hurrying. It was found again last night. Same as the others. Same as 1938. Same as 56. The boy is too young to be told. Marcus will not believe me. If he ever brings a buyer up here, I am to be cremated in the cabin, and the cabin burned to the ground. He must promise. He will not promise. Tomorrow I write the deed back to the county. Let the land sit. Let it sit until somebody comes who knows what to listen for. Eli's hands were not shaking anymore. They were perfectly still. He turned the page. The next entry was 3 days later. The boy is named for me. Eli. Marcus will hate me for it, but the line has to skip. The first one of mine in 3 generations to be born on the ridge and not in town. Maybe him. Maybe not him. Either way, I will not tell. The telling is what feeds it. My father told me on his deathbed, and I have heard it knock every winter since. The boy must come to it on his own. The land will sort it. Eli sat down on the packed earth. He set the lantern beside him. He turned the page again. The handwriting ran on for 60 more pages. 41 years of entries. He read them by lantern light, while the cold air moved past him from somewhere he could not see. He read about a knocking that came up through the floorboards every winter when the snow got deep. He read about a door that had been chained shut in 1891 by a great-great-grandfather Eli had never heard named. He read about a family agreement that the door must never be opened, and the cabin must never be sold, and the line must always know. He read about his father Marcus refusing to know. Refusing to listen. Telling his own father the old man had gone soft in the head from winters alone. Trying to sell the parcel out from under him. Trying twice. Failing twice. The land never quite changing hands. The deed always slipping back somehow. As if the land itself were patient. Eli read until the lantern began to smoke. He closed the book. He put it back on the wooden box. He looked at the iron door. He looked at the padlock. The padlock was oiled because his grandfather had oiled it every winter for 40 years. Every winter until the year his grandfather had died alone in a hospital in Whitehorse with nobody to bring him home. After that the padlock had sat, and the knocking had gone on without an answer for a very long time. He climbed back up through the hole. He sat at his table. He drank the last of the water in his thermos. He put a small handful of pine kindling into the stove and lit it. He watched the flame catch. He thought about his father sliding that paper across the kitchen table 20 years ago. He thought about why his father had needed so badly to sell. He thought about a man who had spent his whole life trying to outrun a sound, coming up through the floorboards of a cabin he could not bring himself to enter. He thought about why his father had disowned him. It had not been about the money. It had not been about the timber. His father had wanted to break the line. His father had wanted nobody left who would come back here. Eli had been the last one his father needed to push away. So his father had pushed. Eli sat at the table for a long time. The fire warmed his hands. He put his palms flat against the wood and felt the grain. His grandfather had cut this table from the same trees as the cabin. The wood remembered. He almost laughed at himself for the thought, the way a man laughs when he is alone and finally understands something he should have understood as a boy. If you are still with me on this one, hit that subscribe button. I want you here when we open that door. Because we are going to open it. We have to. He has to. He went outside before noon. The sun was a flat white circle through a high overcast. He stood in the snow and looked at the trees behind the cabin. He looked for a long time. Then he saw what he had been almost seeing since he arrived. The snow around the cabin lay deep and undisturbed. The snow on the trees lay heavy. But the snow in a rough ring, about 30 feet out from the cabin walls, lay thinner, patchier. In places he could see dark earth and green moss. The ground there was not frozen. The ground in a perfect circle round the cabin had not frozen. He walked the ring. It went all the way around. Where the warm ground ended, the deep snow began again, as if a line had been drawn. He went back inside. He stood over the hole. He looked down at the iron door. He went to his pack. He took out the pry bar. He took out a pair of bolt cutters he had bought at the hardware store in Carmex, without quite knowing why he had bought them. He lowered himself through the hole again. He stood in front of the door. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about a man oiling a padlock alone for 40 winters. He thought about a man writing in a leather book by lantern light, hoping a boy he had only met at Christmas would one day come back. He thought about the knock that had answered his cup against the table that morning. The knock had not been hostile. He understood that now. The knock had been patient. The knock had been a question. The question had been the same for 40 winters. Is anybody there? Is anybody coming? Is anybody of the line still listening? He raised the bolt cutters. He set them around the shackle of the padlock. He stopped. He set them down. This was not the way. The padlock was not the enemy. The padlock was a promise his grandfather had kept. He would keep it too. For now. He sat down with his back against the iron door. He could feel the cold of it through his coat. He took the leather book down from the box. He opened it to a fresh page near the back. He took the stub of a pencil from his pocket. The pencil had a chewed eraser. He pressed the tip against the page. He wrote slowly, in the same slant his grandfather had taught him at the kitchen table when he was 8. I am here. My name is Eli. I am the son of Marcus and the grandson of Eli. I came back. I will keep the door closed for now. I will keep the cabin standing. I will oil the lock every winter the way you did. I will write in the book. When my hand is steady, I will write the rest of the story you did not have time to write. I am sorry I came late. He closed the book. He set it back on the box. He pressed his palm flat against the iron door. Behind the door something shifted. A small dry sound, like a coat being settled around shoulders. Then nothing. He climbed back up. He laid the heavy timbers back across the hole one by one. He drove the iron pegs back in. He laid the floorboards over the timbers and tacked them down with new nails. He spread the tarp across the floor and weighted the corners with stones from the yard. He swept the room. He banked the stove for the night. He stood in the doorway of his grandfather's cabin and looked out at the woods that did not freeze the same way twice. He stayed all winter. He patched the roof in March when the snow eased. He cut new logs for the leaning wall in April. He set a small trapline along the same creek his grandfather had run. He caught marten. He caught fox. He sold the pelts in Watson Lake and bought more nails and a better stove, and a small wood stove pipe that drew clean. He never spoke about the cellar. He oiled the padlock in November the way the book told him to. He wrote in the book by lantern light. He wrote about the day he had walked out of his father's kitchen and the day he had walked back into his grandfather's cabin. He wrote about a man named Marcus who had been afraid of a sound and had spent his whole life trying to silence it with money. He wrote that he forgave his father. He wrote it 3 different ways before it sounded true. Then he wrote it once more in a steadier hand, and he meant it. In April of the 2nd year, a woman came up the road. She was a clerk from the county office. She was older than the one who had stamped his deed. She had driven 4 hours in a county truck because nobody had ever paid the back taxes on the parcel, and somebody had to come check. Eli paid the back taxes in cash from the pelt money. He signed 3 papers. The clerk drank a cup of coffee at his table and looked around the cabin and said her father had once known a Whitlock who ran a line up on Crowfoot. Eli said that was his grandfather. The clerk nodded the way people nod when they understand more than they say. She left a card on the table in case he ever needed anything from the county. He kept the card in the back of the leather book. He never married. He never went south again. His beard went all the way white. His hands stayed thick and slow to warm in the morning, but they held a pencil steady at night. He kept the book. He oiled the lock. The knocking came every winter when the snow got deep. He answered it now. 3 taps against the floorboards with the butt of his rifle. A pause. 3 more. The knocking would stop. The thing below would settle the way a coat settles around shoulders. The woods around the cabin never froze the same way twice. The ring of warm earth stayed at 30 feet, summer and winter. He stopped trying to understand it. Some lines are not for understanding. Some lines are only for keeping. In his last entry, written when his hand had finally gone unsteady for good, he wrote only 1 paragraph. He wrote that he had been disowned for refusing to break a promise he had not yet been told about. He wrote that the promise had been waiting for him under a floor for 40 winters. He wrote that the $4 he had paid at the county office had been the best money he ever spent because what he had bought was not a cabin. What he had bought was the right to come home. He wrote that whoever read this book next should not open the door. He wrote that they should oil the lock. He wrote that they should listen. He wrote that they should answer. He wrote that the line would sort the rest. Then he closed the book and put it back on the wooden box at the foot of the iron door, and he climbed up through the hole one last time, and he laid the heavy timbers back across the opening, and he banked the stove, and he sat in the chair he had built from his grandfather's broken cot, and he waited for the knock the way a man waits for an old friend at the door. And when it came, 3 slow taps and a pause and 3 more, he tapped back, and the cabin grew quiet, and outside the woods stood still, and the ring of warm earth held the snow back one more time, the way it always had, the way it always would, for as long as somebody of the line was left to listen.